So as I said, we have the section of the Bible from Isaiah to Daniel tonight. And so we start with Isaiah. Ordinarily, I am preaching through different passages in Isaiah during Advent. I don't know that I have ever preached something from Isaiah outside of Advent, but give me a little bit of time. We'll get there. Anyway, the theme of Isaiah is this. The Holy One of Israel challenges his people to respond appropriately to his presence among them. If you want a theme verse, it would be Isaiah 42, verse 1. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is going on in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah was a highly educated guy, and I'm sure that his parents, who were elites in Judah's high society, had very, very high hopes for their son. But God had something very different in mind. He called Isaiah to a long and kind of thankless prophetic ministry during a period of great uncertainty politically in Judah's history. So by the time Isaiah hits the scene, the northern tribes of Israel, the 10 tribes, have already been conquered and removed from their homeland by the Assyrians in 722 BC. And, the southern tribes, the 2 tribes of Judah, were threatened by Assyria as well in 701 BC, but they were spared because of God's divine intervention. The time was not right, okay? However, Isaiah saw with his prophetic eyes a pretty gloomy picture of the not-so-distant future. So Assyria's empire would pass away and a new empire would rise up, that of the Babylonians. And it would be Babylon who accomplished the destruction of Judah. So that's what Isaiah saw. But, in his visions, there were also pictures of deliverance as well. A deliverance that would be brought about by some mysterious servant figure. And so Isaiah, as he preached to his people, as he preached to his contemporaries, he shared that he had envisioned 2 possible outcomes. The one outcome would be judgment for rebels, and the other outcome would be deliverance for servants. Which outcome came to pass was entirely dependent on the response of God's people to his presence among them. The Holy One of Israel is a title for God that occurs 26 times in the book of Isaiah, and it reflects Isaiah's concern that his people respond appropriately to this holy and awesome God in their midst. Now, Isaiah had, and you probably remember this story, he had experienced God's presence firsthand when he received his prophetic call. And he immediately, in the presence of God, understood his unworthiness. And yet he jumped at the opportunity to enter into God's service. And Isaiah's response to God's presence should have been a model for all of the people in Judah. But instead of responding to God with fruitful service, at least a willingness to engage in fruitful service, they produced, as we talked about this morning, only rotten fruit. They chose to be rebels rather than servants. And so the day of judgment for them was inevitable. But then in the second half of Isaiah's prophecy, he talks about this servant. A servant who would respond to God perfectly and would be then the means by which God would do wonderful things once again for his people. And of course, that mysterious servant figure that Isaiah points to is, at that point, the coming Jesus Christ. Of course, that brings us to the Christ focus of Isaiah. The primary focus of Isaiah's prophecy pointed toward a boy whose name reminded everyone that there were consequences for how they lived in the presence of a holy God. And of course, that boy's name was to be Emmanuel, which literally meant God with us. See, God had always been present with his people, guiding them and instructing them and caring for them. But he wanted and he would get even closer to his people, because God himself would become one of them. Matthew 1:23, the virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. God's presence with his people in the person of Jesus Christ challenged them to respond to God appropriately so that they could have peace and joy and rest. Jesus, while he walked the earth, reminded people that they were accountable to God for their actions. And he also showed them by his own life how far they had deviated from the path of life that God had revealed to them and set before them. But you know what happens. As a matter of fact, we're going to remember that in a very poignant way here in a few weeks. As it turns out, it was far easier for sinful people to get rid of Jesus than to do the internal spiritual work and find that they had wasted their lives. And so the only true servant of God was tortured and crucified by those who had chosen to rebel against God and go their own way. But it is through Jesus' suffering that God would bring deliverance and blessing even to those rebels. Because God had become one of his people, he could secure his relationship with his people forever by his own perfect obedience. And he could also exhaust his judgment on his rebellious people by allowing the only one who didn't deserve it to experience it for the rest of us. What amazing love. But wait, there's even more. So that his people might still come to know the rich life that he desired for them when they walk the path that he has shown us in his word. God sent the Spirit of this perfect servant to indwell each believer in order to transform us from rebels to servants. So that's the book of Isaiah. Moving on to the book of Jeremiah with the theme, God promises his people a new covenant beyond the necessary exile. Jeremiah 31:33, this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Summary. Things had become much worse in the southern kingdom since the days of Isaiah. The people of Judah had reverted quickly from the sweeping reforms that young King Josiah had instituted. They had reverted from that to the moral decay that characterized the reigns of Josiah's successors. And so Jeremiah was called to spend his adult life being the voice of God, the ignored relationship partner to these people who just simply refused to listen. No wonder Isaiah Or no wonder Jeremiah, unlike Isaiah, resisted his call to ministry. He knew that it was going to be rough. God's people seemed bent on rejecting the covenant or their special relationship with God. So how could God allow them to remain in this land that he had given to them? This land that symbolized that relationship between God and his people. How could he allow them to stay in this land that symbolized such a wonderful thing in that relationship when it was clear that they didn't even want a relationship with God? So though it grieved him, God would bring the Babylonians in 586 BC to take his beloved people into exile, where they would reflect on what they had done and what they had given up. But God, great in his faithfulness, still refused to give up on his people. Through Jeremiah, God announced that he would establish yet a new relationship with them, unlike the previous one that had proved obviously impossible for them to maintain. This relationship, this covenant, would indeed be something entirely new. And so Jeremiah tried to get his countrymen to see that the things that they were trusting in instead of God would ultimately fail them. But again, like the prophecies and the preaching of Isaiah, it was no use. For the people of Jeremiah's time, trusting in political and military allies, trusting in accommodating preachers, trusting in religious structures and routines, trusting even in other gods, all seemed so much more comfortable and so much more expedient than relying on the old-fashioned God of their ancestors. But Jeremiah kept trying. He explained to them that in any healthy relationship, each of the parties in the relationship need to listen attentively. Each of the parties in a relationship need to respond appropriately to each other. And look, God had and God has always listened. God had and God has always responded appropriately to his people. But in the days of Jeremiah, the people had stopped listening and responding to him. The relationship had deteriorated and it was in a desperate place. Despite Jeremiah's pleading, God's people refused counsel. And so the relationship would be dissolved, at least for a time, due to irreconcilable differences. God removed his people from his presence, but before doing so, God made a promise that was as incredibly gracious as it was impossible for the people to comprehend. After the punishment, after the judgment, after this period of exile that was absolutely necessary for his people to reflect on what they had lost, God would somehow enter into a new relationship with his people that could never be broken. Which brings us to the Christ focus. God became a human being in the person of Jesus Christ for two reasons. And both of them have to do with this new relationship that Jeremiah preached about to his people, and by extension to us. First, God requires an unfailing and representative relationship partner. It's got to be a human being. It's got to be a human relationship partner that is unfailing, that is perfect, and yet at the same time represents humanity with whom he is in relationship with. If there's any possibility of an unfailing, never to fail relationship between God and humanity in the future, there's got to be one. There's got to be one perfect human being. So that's the first thing that Jeremiah talks about. The first Christ-focused thing that Jeremiah talks about. The second, this representative human being must experience the divine judgment that is deserved by all human beings who have neglected or ignored that relationship that God wants to have. It must be sufficient to pay for all of the failings of all of God's human relationship partners, past, present, and future. And of course, there's only one person who accomplishes both. That is Jesus Christ. His union with the Father is unbroken by any human failings. His perfect faithfulness in the divine-human relationship ensures that God's relationship with all those who make Jesus their representative is just as secure as the Son's relationship with the Father. Talked about that too a little bit this morning. But there's still an enormous outstanding debt for unfaithfulness that has to be paid. God is holy and just, and he simply cannot ignore the sins of his people, or the sins of anyone for that matter. There has to be judgment. And the way that Jeremiah describes this judgment is as a cup filled with the wine of God's wrath. A cup filled with the wine of God's wrath that everyone on the face of the earth deserves to drink. This is the cup that Jesus agreed to take on behalf of you and me. Luke 22, verse 20, in the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." And so holding this physical cup in his hand, Jesus alludes to that other scarier cup that he would have to drink very soon. In order for the new unbreakable relationship that his faithfulness had merited to become a reality for God's people, Jesus would also have to pay the price for their sins. Jesus accomplishes this new covenant, this new relationship with God, at the cost of his blood. Jesus drank down the cup of God's wrath to the last drop so that every human being he represents is assured of a lasting relationship with God that is not even broken by unfaithfulness on our part. That is amazing. And that's the book of Jeremiah. Now, it's kind of an addendum because he is credited with this book as well. We have the book of Lamentations. Jeremiah is most widely recognized as being the author of Lamentations, though I suppose it can't be proven. I don't know why it matters. But Lamentations is one of those books that, as I was going through once again, was a little bit less familiar to me. But the theme of Lamentations is God's loving compassion and faithfulness are present even during the cataclysmic destruction of Jerusalem. Lamentations 3, verses 22 and 23. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. So, God had brought the Babylonians to judge his people, and they had done a very thorough job of it. All the things that God's people had put their trust in were gone. The temple was gone, that place that symbolized God's presence among his people. All their religious rituals were gone. All their dearly held customs and rituals were gone. Everything was gone. And so people were asking, and Jeremiah, the author of Lamentations, is asking as well, is God gone too? The author of Lamentations has put his troubled thoughts to poetry, rhythmic, passionate, pleading, mournful. In the depths of his anguish, he clings to that one truth that gives him hope, that even though we are unfaithful, God is not. God tempers his wrath with love, and his compassion always accompanies his judgment. Now, God's people in exile came to realize that their actions, their behavior, their attitudes had warranted the judgment that had come upon him. What was actually harder for them to understand was that God had not destroyed them completely. And the only reason that was given to them for being spared was God's great love. And ultimately, that's really all that we can cling to in difficult times. If we're trusting in anything else to get us through, we, like the people who gazed in disbelief at the charred remains of their city, will be jolted into an awareness of our misplaced trust when those things that we have put our trust in disappear. In the coming storm of God's judgment against the sin of all humanity, it is only the Lord's great love, once again, that will keep us from being consumed. That love would become a human being and dwell among us. Christ focus of Lamentations, because of the Lord's great love, or in the words of the New Testament, because God so loved the world, we are not abandoned to the horrible consequences of our sin and our failings. In his compassion, God sent his Son to secure for us that new relationship that Jeremiah talked about. And the one who secured our relationship with God forever also preserves and nurtures that relationship when adverse circumstances try to get us to doubt it. See, Jesus knows that just because our eternal future is secure, that does not mean that our contemporary present will necessarily be trouble-free. So, Jesus has sent his Spirit to indwell each one of us, to give us peace, to give us confidence, even when our world gets turned upside down. The faithful presence of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Christ, comforts us in any trouble. He reminds us that God has already saved us from ourselves and secured a relationship with the Father forever. God will never abandon his people, his chosen relationship partners, and his compassions will never fail. Ezekiel, theme, God's presence. There's a lot about God's presence in these prophets. But Ezekiel is all about God's presence being the key to life. Ezekiel 37, verse 5. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. Now, Judah's end had not come all at once. Even before the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, an event that was lamented in the previous book, Babylon had already devastated the nation of Judah. Judah had actually come under Babylon's control in 605 BC. Several years later, in 597 BC, after Judah's king Jehoiakim had rebelled against Babylonian rule, King Nebuchadnezzar paid the city a pretty unpleasant visit. He took away all the treasures of the royal palace and the temple. He put a new king on the throne, and he took away into exile 10,000 people, including King Jehoiakim himself. Now, one of those men that Nebuchadnezzar took into exile was a man named Ezekiel, whom God called to be a prophet from his place of exile in Babylon. With graphic imagery and picturesque language and symbolic acts and powerful words, Ezekiel's prophecies showed God's people that the slow death that they were experiencing was a natural consequence of their gradual but relentless turning away from the one who gives life, the only one who can give life. In his visions, Ezekiel saw something alarming. namely that God's presence was leaving the temple. Now, when God's presence withdraws, life departs as well. Ezekiel experienced firsthand the displacement and discouragement, the chaos and death that results from an absence of God's presence. He pleaded with his people to run for their lives back to the source of all life. But again, like the other prophets that we talked about tonight, the people just would not listen. Even after the fall of Jerusalem, Ezekiel continued to prophesy, and through Ezekiel, God reminded his people that life is and still could be found in him. Though they had rejected God and experienced his judgment, they could still yet have life in him. Now, apart from him, they were nothing but dry bones. However, if and when they returned to him, God could make their dry bones come to life. Christ focus in Ezekiel. Just as God's presence with his people in the Old Testament involved the entrance of his glory into the temple, so Jesus reminds us that he is the glory of God when he enters the temple. Then Jesus went even further and referred to himself as the temple, God's visible presence among his people. Now, the challenge for the people in the time of Ezekiel is the same as the challenge for the people in the time of Jesus, and is the same challenge for people today. Will we welcome and treasure God's presence among us and experience the life that flows from that presence like a river? Or will we resist and reject God's presence among us and become like a valley of dry bones? Life is found in Jesus Christ, and he has demonstrated in words and actions that he has plenty of life to share. Even when it appeared that death had overcome him, he burst open its doors and appeared in radiant life and light, an unambiguous display of abundant life that will one day overtake absolutely everything. All who acknowledge Jesus as the source of life participate in the life that he gives, a life that is as eternal and rich as the God who gives it. Last one of the night, Daniel. Theme: God asserts his authority over human kingdoms. Daniel 2, verses 20 to 21. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and season. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning." So Daniel was taken into captivity by the Babylonians even earlier than Ezekiel was. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, invaded Judah in 605 BC during the first year of King Jehoiakim's reign. And at that time, Jehoiakim submitted to Nebuchadnezzar and paid him off with tribute and hostages, including one scared little boy named Daniel. So Daniel actually grew up in a foreign land where he was groomed for the king's service. Now, as a believer, as a believing Jew, Daniel must have been tempted to conclude that the God of Israel had completely lost control of this situation. He must have been tempted to believe that it was human kings and military generals that directed and shaped the course of world events. Well, the question of who is ultimately in control comes to a head in this book, when a human king commanded Daniel and his friends to do something that his heavenly king had forbidden, namely to bow down to an image or an idol of that human king. Nebuchadnezzar Daniel himself, all of God's people need to be reminded that even though circumstances may argue to the contrary, God is still, always has been, and always will be in control of his creation. Later in Daniel's life, the Babylonian Empire turned to dust, and God raised up a new empire, that of the Persians. Daniel then served a new king, Darius, who also needed to be taught that there was one, at least, who was greater than he or any other king. Daniel received a series of visions that enabled him to see into the future. In those visions, full of symbolic imagery, God deposed kings and raised up others. Did all of this in the course of accomplishing his and his alone redemptive purposes. And Daniel saw also in those visions that there was no one in heaven or on earth that could oppose God. The Most High asserts his authority over one human kingdom after another until his everlasting kingdom and authority are established. That same authority accompanied the one who came to usher in that kingdom. Christ focus in Daniel. We're almost done. Jesus brought God's divine authority into focus by his teaching, by his forgiving of sins, by driving out evil spirits, by healing every disease and illness. Jesus also exercised divine authority over the natural elements so that even the winds and the waves obeyed him. Now, in the book of Daniel, it appears for a while as if God's authority has been superseded. But just so you know, in similar cases today, looks can often be deceiving. God demonstrated his authority over Babylonian and Persian kings by unmistakable demonstrations of his power. And the same can be said of God's Son. Crucifixion made it appear for a while that human authority had again superseded divine authority. But God demonstrated his authority over jealous Jewish leaders and petty Roman officials and even death itself by raising Jesus from the dead. Jesus has divine authority over all things in heaven and on earth. This authority was given to him by the Father, and it is an authority that he continues to exercise. One day, brothers and sisters, everyone will acknowledge that authority. And we pray for that day to come and to come soon.